Hello and good afternoon, morning, wherever you are in Australia. Welcome to the webinar on disclosure of childhood sexual abuse through the life course, findings from the literature. My apologies in starting. My name's Gary Foster. We're a little bit late. We're just working through some tech issues and hopefully it'll all be seamless from here. Look, apparently, we have over 90 people signed up for this, and I welcome that so many people are interested in the topic. And I just remind people that we are recording this, and this webinar will be available later on, hopefully within the next week or so. So I'd like to just start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting. Across this country. I'm in Mianjin, and it's where it's the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. I'd like to thank the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for caring for the lands and the peoples upon it, and supporting us in our learning about how we can improve our services and responses. And I'd also like to acknowledge elders past and present, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples with us today. Including in the acknowledgement, I'd like to acknowledge all those people with lived and living experience of childhood sexual abuse and sexual assault and harmful childhood experiences. I'd like to thank you all for sharing your knowledge and understanding with us and helping us to improve our services. And invite you to continue to prioritize your well-being and take care of yourself as part of this webinar. And I'd like to indicate that although we're talking about this difficult topic of childhood sexual abuse, we will not be looking to go into lots of details, that we want to be sensitive to the language that we're using. And so please do, though, continue to take care of yourself. Use your, have a nice glass of water or stand up and stretch your legs. As I said, this webinar is recorded. So before we start the webinar, I would like to acknowledge that the support of everybody involved with this research, but also in collectively in helping us to improve services. So I'd like to acknowledge the National Centre for Action on Childhood Sexual Abuse for child sexual abuse for supporting and funding this research project. I'd like to acknowledge the our Australian Centre for Child Protection out of the University of South Australia and the Disrupting Violence Beacon at Griffith University, and also our friends and colleagues at Fighters Against Abuse Australia and Survivors and Mates Support Network who'll be with us today. We do have a pretty packed webinar. There will be 6 speakers. My role is to keep that flowing through. I'd just like to highlight who we will be speaking today. We'll be starting with Professor Patrick O'Leary, who's co-director of the Griffith University Violence Beacon. He'll be talking about insights from the literature. Professor Leah Bromfield will then be talking about conceptualizing disclosure through life course. Leah is Director and Chair of the Child Protection Centre, Chair of Child Protection at the University of South Australia. Then we'll have Adam Washburn talking. He's the founder and president of the Fighters Against Child Abuse Australia. He'll be talking about supporting adult survivors. We'll have Amanda Payton, Deputy Director at the Practice at the University of South Australia Centre for Child Protection, and she'll be talking about supporting children and their families in the aftermath of disclosure. Anna Borgia will then speak as a research fellow and psychologist from Griffith University Beacon. She'll talk about gender and culture, specific experiences in disclosure. And finally, we'll have Craig Hughes Cashmore, who's CEO of Survivors and Mates Support Network, who'll talk about male survivors, queer identity and disclosure. There will be opportunity for questions at the end, so we do invite you to post the Q&A questions, and we hopefully have times to answer those through the process. As I said, please do look after yourself during this presentation, and hopefully I'll hand over to Patrick. Over to you, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Gary, and I will start. And we've had some technical issues, but I can see that welcome 47 people are online at the moment, and it's great to have you here. Really setting the context of this is to highlight that disclosure is a critical aspect of how we respond to child sexual abuse. And anyone, whether they're a professional or a community member, a parent, a teacher, whatever role, might actually receive a disclosure, whether it be from a child or from an adult, whether it be an attempt for help or whether it be someone wanting to share their story with us. So it's really important issue in terms of fully understanding it in the contemporary context. And with that background, disclosure is often been seen as a process only more recently. It's not been well defined. It's often been seen as a one-off event, an event partly influenced because of the historical nature of the secrecy of child sexual abuse. It's often been seen as an attempt to seek help or seek justice from the child. And therefore, it hasn't been really conceptualised as a process throughout people's lives. And with this, it's tended to be seen as a process of asking for help rather than actually seeking attention to needs, trauma needs, how it influences life events. And importantly here, research has tended to focus on barriers and facilitators to disclosures, and rather an assumption here that how do you actually increase disclosures? But what research tells us more often is that it's such a pivotal moment, disclosure, a non-supportive, non-believing response can really influence the outcomes for survivors. Some of the research shows that can increase mental health effects compared to those who didn't disclose because of the nature of the response. So I'm just going to move to the next slide if I can, and just give you a brief overview of this project. We're at the stage where we're about to do some research with victim survivors. And prior to this, what we're presenting on today is the academic and grey literature that's arisen from our review, and also a qualitative analysis of what's available in the academic literature, an existing analysis of victim survivor accounts. So we're going to be sharing those findings across the lifespan of the project. And this has been guided by an advisory group of victim survivors and advocates, some of who are presenting today. We very much acknowledge that their contributions have really shaped how we've interpreted the results that we're presenting today. And you'll see that in both Leah and I'll highlight how that has changed the way we've seen things. We'll be hoping to share more of the findings as we go through the project. This is one stage of the project, and we hope to be informing our audience more about the results from actually talking to victim survivors. So some key learnings from the literature is that disclosure is a gradual process often. It takes shape and evolves across a survivor's life. It can occur in context. For a child, it might be about safety or asking for help or being confused about a particular issue of sexual abuse. For other survivors, it might be about making people aware of the trauma needs. It might be about survivor solidarity. It might be about advocacy. It might be about trust. And that occurs across men and women's lives, males and females' lives, according to identity, relationships. People may feel more able to or want to disclose at a pivotal point in their life. Could be crisis, life events such as becoming a parent. It might be about how they're actually processing a particular issue that's happening. It could be a medical issue. It could be entering an institution, entering education. That might prompt a disclosure. Both male and female victim survivors are subject to different responses according to gendered responses and stereotypes. For example, for men, homophobia might play a role because most perpetrators tend to be male. And the ideas of masculinity may influence their levels of safety and ability to disclose to others. There's also often myths like that victims become perpetrators. Despite these myths being incorrect, often they're held in media and other sorts of communication that can be very much influential in survivors' decision to disclose. We also know that a safe and trusting relationship, being believed, being supported, both during and prior to disclosure events, constitutes a helpful disclosure process for all people, whether they be children or adults, regardless of their gender. A disclosure response in the literature really highlighted the important points in how people can be supported through that process, whether it be through a professional or through a personal relationship. And we also recognise that there's gaps in the literature regarding, for example, non-binary people, gender diverse, but also people from different cultural and religious backgrounds where the disclosure may be met with other sorts of complex issues in both community and beliefs. If I can have the next slide, please. So we can contextualize this across a number of spheres, and this was really influenced in our last advisory meeting with victim survivors and advocates. And you can see in this diagram on the outer edge is culture. What are the cultural beliefs about child sexual abuse? What's the cultural beliefs about victim survivors? We can see that often victim survivors are pathologized rather than celebrated for their strength. This can influence our environment. And we've seen more recently in public disclosures, including, for example, the Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, has put a message out that survivors can thrive. The disclosure environment about how survivors' responses are received, what are the supportive environments for survivors influence that. And of course, the person who receives the disclosure is critical. That can be whether that's a professional or a personal relationship. And that is influenced by the purpose of the disclosure. Is it a disclosure about wanting to seek justice? Is it a disclosure about their needs at a particular point in their life? Is it a disclosure to a partner about feeling trust and safety in the relationship that they can share aspects of their lives? And this occurs throughout the lifespan, through childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, and later adulthood. It shows the importance of the responsibilities of the context here. That shouldn't fall all on the survivor or the victim. Here, the responsibility falls on the broader systems about how we educate potential recipients of disclosures, whether they be professionals, community members, or systems that victim survivors need to navigate when they make a disclosure. These responsibilities are critical. Thank you. I'll hand to Leah.
Over to you, Leah.
Hi everyone, I'm Leah. I'm joining from Ghana country today. I also just want to acknowledge the traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I wanted to recognise Eden Thane and Danielle Perfect from the Australian Centre for Child Protection, who are co-authors on the two papers that I'll be discussing, and to just personally acknowledge victim survivors whose willingness to share their experiences and insights actually makes all of this research possible. We don't know about victim survivor experiences of disclosures without victim survivors being willing to share what the literature tells us are often horrible responses. So I just wanted to acknowledge how much victim survivors continue to give. Patrick has spoken to you about kind of the first element of our project, which was the systematic review of the academic literature. That's the literature that's published in academic books and journal articles. I'm going to start by sharing, well, I'm going to share findings from two supplementary pieces that we did. The first is what in research we call a review of the grey literature. And that really is literature that's not in academic journals and books. It doesn't make it less than, it's just different. And often will include actually some really big research reports and things that might be published by organisations or by governments. It also includes a lot of practice reports and guidance and fact sheets. So we were focused on the Australian context. So in our grey literature search, which kind of used the same types of search terms as the academic literature, we found 49 Australian documents, and they really mirrored the same kinds of findings that we saw in the systematic review in terms of, if you open your eyes to it, the literature shows us that disclosure is a process over the lifespan. Survivors have been telling us that repeatedly. We just haven't been paying enough attention to what they were saying. The different context, purpose and impacts for disclosure repeated. Similar barriers and facilitators are identified. I think what's interesting in the grey literature is just looking at the categories that it fell into. So by far the largest category was actually guidance on responding to disclosure. But when you unpack this, it's actually predominantly guidance on responding to children who make a disclosure, not responding to adults who make a disclosure, or a disclosure in the context of a relationship, or disclosure in the context of entering aged care, or disclosure in context of personal medical care that can be deeply triggering. So we've really, in our guidance, focused on one aspect of disclosure, and that's disclosures by children. Really, really important. But to me, it really highlights this continuing simplification and incongruency in our discussion of disclosure. So this same literature talks about how it's on average 20 years to disclosure, and in that context kind of frames the need for adult responses. And yet we have guidance that speaks about children. We need both. And I think we need to be really careful about the way that our disclosure literature takes a systems view and then a narrow lens depending on where that person was in the system, where the writer was in the system. If we change slides, the second piece that I wanted to talk about, and here I want to acknowledge Eden Thane as the lead author, is a qualitative analysis of victim survivor accounts. Now, in research language, we call this a secondary data analysis. That's because we're looking again at information that's already been published, but we're looking at it through a new lens. So we looked at themes that were associated with disclosure over time in publicly available accounts that were published by the National Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse and the Tasmanian Commission of Inquiry. We need to do a bit of balancing here in terms of our ethical considerations. we didn't want to go and speak to victim survivors, which is our next step in this project, without being sure that we'd already listened, that we'd paid attention to what victim survivors had already said to us. So we did want to look at these accounts. We did recognise that these accounts were, while they were public, they were shared for the purpose of these inquiries. So we treated them like we would in ethics to research data. We anonymised, we've not got full accounts, we've pulled out quotes so that there's not a sense of surprise at a victim survivor going, someone's just taken my story and republished it. So we've absolutely not done that. And we wanted to focus on the process over time, to really have that focused when we were looking at it, to look at themes rather than a narrow lens on barriers and facilitators, and to have that focus across the life course rather than focusing on children or adults. So just really, I guess, in the equivalent of kind of qualitative data, just sitting with it, listening to what those voices were saying without a preconceived systemic lens. I can go to the next slide. So within this, once again, we saw a lot of the same themes from the grey literature and the systemic literature. But when we looked at this and we did sit with what victim survivors were saying rather than a preconceived notion, we saw that the focus on barriers and facilitators was really masking a whole lot of complexity in the stories that were being shared. When you look at those accounts, you see stories of repeated disclosures across the lifespan, and you see these cycles where the response to a disclosure is going to impact what you do next with your story. So we found that there were Patrick talked a lot about the context, but if you thought about those contexts as contexts that afforded disclosure or constrained disclosure, you still have choice being a really important part of this, and particularly for adult survivors who made conscious choices, who said, well, in this context, I think that based on all my past experience, telling this person is going to be terrible, so I'm choosing not to make a disclosure here. We also saw that responses and reactions to disclosure is part of that cycle. So the barriers and facilitators kind of framing is really kind of makes you think about a disclosure, and makes you doesn't highlight the way in which a positive response, a negative response, or a harmful response can really make a significant difference on what happens next, how you might tell your story in the future. And just the lack of agency that's implicit in that framing, that the right thing to do is to disclose. I can move on to the next slide. One of the things we specifically looked at was disclosure over time. So we've talked about disclosure over the life course and that aspect of time. We also wanted to know whether responses to disclosure, in terms of what victim survivors told us about their experiences, had changed over time. And in order to do this, we really looked at the different decades victim survivors were reported coming from in terms of their experience of abuse and neglect and their disclosure experiences. And it's actually really difficult to draw conclusions. It's apparent that we just pull the literature together in a pretty unsophisticated way. We don't talk about when, which makes it really hard for us to tell if we've gotten better. And that's really important for our public policy, to actually know if we're getting better. It's important for victim survivors to know if all of the advocacy and the interventions they've made into the service system is actually making a difference. So from what we could tell within this, it was actually quite disappointing. So in what we talked about as, I guess, affording contests, so I guess the facilitators to disclosure, there was actually limited evidence of an increase in positive things happening. We did see some evidence of a decrease in really harmful responses. So if I kind of give some examples there, so not a huge increase in positive responses in terms of people being that trusted, authentic person, demonstrating the care in systems of responding appropriately, but a decrease in some of the the very harsh, harmful responses like dismissing, failing to act, punishing children, children experiencing further abuse when they tried to ask for help. So some positives, but not nearly enough. And I think that probably segues well onto our panel. So I'm going to hand back to Gary to introduce our panel to speak about their lived experience in different roles.
I think I'm actually going to jump in here, if that's okay. We are having a few tech issues and Adam will be joining us soon. So my name's Amanda Payton, and as Gary introduced before, so I'm the Deputy Director of Practice at the Australian Centre for Child Protection. I'm here on, Whadjuk Noongar country, and just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am joining you from today. I'm a clinical psychologist and have worked and had the privilege of working for probably about 20 odd years in this space, working with children and young people and their families. And I wanted to try and bring a different kind of a different perspective to it, I suppose, in the time that I've got with you today. And so I've worked in many contexts where I've received initial disclosures myself, and then have supported children and their families as they go through the forensic interview process, and also then in the years after, when they continue to disclose and explore their experiences. And really in line with what Patrick and Leah have spoke about, this it's not a one-off event, and it really is a process that continues. And for some, I've seen a disclosure be a really, really healing process. And for others, it's just been the beginning of more distress and more pain. And, you know, that idea of kind of sometimes the cure is worse than the illness, I suppose, if we want to take that analogy. As adults, I think it's comforting, and we like to think that if a child discloses, it will be better. You know, they'll be safe, they'll be able to thrive, everything will be fine, and the abuse will stop. The abuser will be held responsible, and, you know, everything will kind of just kind of resolve. They may experience some trauma, but, you know, they'll manage it, they'll move over it, and they'll be able to progress through their life as long as they have a positive experience of telling their story. Sadly, I suppose in my experience working with, you know, hundreds and probably thousands of children who have experienced child sexual abuse over the years, and being a part of their disclosure journey, nothing could be farther from the truth, I think, from my experience, for some kids and for some families. And whilst it's imperative that we do have experiences that are supportive and that are therapeutic, it's really not enough. And, you know, some of the literature Leah mentioned, where we have, you know, over 40% of some of the grey literature really focuses on managing that acute disclosure and how the practical element of it for children. I think sometimes we forget about the family, we forget about the siblings, we forget about what happens in the continuous disclosure that often goes on throughout the life course. So disclosure is really the beginning of what's a very long and challenging journey for many children, and really sets on a chain reaction that they'll reflect on later in adolescence and adulthood, and some will describe that whole process as really being worse than the abuse in some instances, particularly where court and there's further kind of system experiences. And Leah spoke about that the multiple disclosures over time, and some have a positive impact and some actually have a constricting impact and can change how next disclosures happen and how people talk through it. Children may sometimes, the realities are they may disclose and they may still have to see their perpetrator, particularly when we're talking about family court issues or where there's not enough, evidence, as some might say in the legal sense. They may lose a court process even if they get to take it to court in the first place. They can spend years and years actually taking it through that, with having to go through forensic interviews and cross-examination, being separated from parents during that process, and all the while for a child during that, they have to miss out on school, they miss out on things and sports with their mates and miss out on friends, and they're continuously having to be consumed by their disclosure and by their experiences for an extended period of time. And that quite often will spark huge trauma experiences for kids, in terms of the angst of having to relive it continuously. Their trauma symptoms can actually get worse after a disclosure, not better, particularly as they're having to face those experiences and face the realities of what's happened to them. It can then be, we have puberty lessons in school from, about year 5 all the way through to year 10 and year 11. The children who've experienced child sexual abuse and who've disclosed and gone through that, every time those lessons come up in class, they're reminded of it at different life stages. When they get their first boyfriend or girlfriend, or start to have intimate relationships, or have children of their own, or as they grow up and their children reach the age when they were first abused. All these life experiences and going into aged care, or facing the loss of a partner, these can all trigger further disclosures and further experiences of trauma throughout their life. And I think sometimes we forget, and we treat disclosure as an acute process when children are young, but we forget that this doesn't go away. It's a lifelong journey. And so we need to ensure that appropriate trauma-informed supports are really provided throughout that, not just at that initial stage. Secondary to that, though, is the family. And if we think of when we hop on an aeroplane and we're told to, put on that oxygen mask first before we actually put it on our children, we need to take that same approach. We need to make sure that we support parents and we support siblings and we support kin and family, to help them put on their oxygen mask, not just to actually focus on the child. And so we need to really look at victim and survivor advocates and supporters that sit around that child, whether they are a child when they disclose or whether it's later in life, because there's this ripple effect of disclosures. When I talk about working with families, I often think of the very kind of raw experience when a child does disclose. So if we can imagine a parent, getting ready for their kids at school, they're, fixing their lunches, getting them ready, they're dropping them off to school, and then they're getting off to work. It's a really normal morning. Everything's going as a typical day. But then the child goes to school and they've decided that today's the day that they're going to talk to their friends about what's happened. And they, talk to their friends and they make their first disclosure. What then happens then, even if all the people in the school environment respond in the most appropriate way and empathic way and do everything that we would want them to do to support that child to manage the disclosure, it sets off this chain reaction, one of multiple interactions where that child's story is told, maybe to the school psychologist and the principal, and then there's other people are going to talk to the child while they're at the school, and then police and child protection might be involved, and then they'll want to come and talk to the child as well. But what also happens is then that parent who thought it was just a typical day and dropped them off to school, they'll get that phone call and they'll then be confronted with the situation that their child's been sexually abused. Maybe it's their partner or their granddad or their neighbour or whoever it might be in their family system. And their whole world falls apart. The child's been preparing in some instances, they've been playing it over in their mind how they might make that disclosure. But all of a sudden we have a family in chaos and in distress, and they're managing simultaneously their own shame and guilt and anger and trauma about what's happened to their child. But sometimes there's real practical impacts of a disclosure being made as well. You know, the person that's being the abuser might be the breadwinner in the house. They might provide the housing or the financial stability. They might provide the majority of the childcare or the parental support, and all of that is really taken away. And the consequences or the secondary consequences of a disclosure, whilst we might manage them in the best possible way that we can for the child, they see the impacts of that. They see the distress that causes to their parents, to their system, to everyone around them. They feel the presence of the guilt and the shame, and they play that over. And then we start getting kind of thoughts of things like, if only I didn't tell, if only I kept it a secret, then, you know, my mum wouldn't be distressed. She wouldn't be sad all the time. We wouldn't have to have moved schools or had to move house and those type of things. And so we have to think of disclosure not just happening to the child, it happens to the family and everyone around the child. And whilst we need to do our absolute best to support the child in that situation, we need to remember that it comes up throughout their life, but it doesn't just impact them. And we need to make sure that we put the oxygen mask on the family around them so they can continue to support the child too. And when I use the word child, I mean, you know, that child that becomes then an adolescent and becomes an adult. So it's not a process, and it arguably never ends. And I think it does for lots of kids that I have worked with over the years. It does begin with internal thoughts that the child has as they play those words out in their mind, even before they speak it out loud. But even when they do speak those words out loud, that discourse, that internal and external kind of discourse where they share that with others, it never ends and it continues. And then it does enter the minds of parents and siblings and family as well. And so our response to disclosures really needs to align with that too, and really make sure we wrap around the child and the family throughout their life and treat it as a process.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I think it's really appreciative to think both of the child and the adult that grows up and the ripple effects for the person throughout their life of that disclosure or making a decision of that disclosure, and also all those other family members who may or not have an awareness in the same way prior to this topic being raised. So we've managed to have Adam Washburn, who is the founder and president of the Fighters Against Child Abuse Australia, has now managed to listen in, and hopefully we're going to, through some sort of trickery, have Adam present about the experience of working with and supporting adults disclosing.
Firstly, thanks for the trickery, and I apologise for the issues with logging on. As was said, my name is Adam Washburn. I'm from Fighters Against Child Abuse Australia. We are in Liverpool, New South Wales, which is on the land of the Darug and Tharawal people. I'm speaking today on behalf of the survivors. We have several programs in place, all of them lived experience, volunteer run. And one of those programs is our lived experience court support program. Now, during that time, we've had quite a few cases where we've gone in and just been a hand for them to hold, a voice to listen, and someone to bear witness to what they're going through. And that's really highlighted to us the absolute importance of the correct handling of disclosures, and also that the trauma doesn't end with disclosure. In fact, in some cases, it can be just the beginning. So with that in mind, that's kind of where I'm coming from today. Disclosures have to be handled correctly. They have to be handled with empathy and compassion. People also have to realise that disclosures are not a one-off event. They are a constantly evolving and often changing, fluid event. Now, one case that really highlighted this was one where we were in court and the parent had given the statement to the police directly from the mouth of her then 6-year-old child. And when it came time for the court process, the child was 9, and the defence team had started to attack various statements and attack the fact that the disclosure had changed. Now, to us, it was very obvious that a 9-year-old is not going to think the same as a 6-year-old. A 9-year-old isn't going to talk the same as a 6-year-old. So obviously there was going to be little things changed, but the defence used it to cross-examine this 9-year-old and absolutely hammered him. This poor girl was on the stand. They even tried the old chestnut of you started this, which just disgusted us. And so we found that there was a real need for them, for the system, the court system, to understand the fact that this little girl was a child and a traumatised child, and her statement was going to change. And also, we watched as she was re-traumatised again and again and again. And we, the judge at the time was quite nice. They ordered breaks and things like that. But there's only so much that legally they can do. Now, slight issues with the initial disclosure can lead to massive issues down the track. When defence lawyers find little issues, they can use them to just hammer the poor victim survivor. So disclosures must be encouraged and correctly handled. And for our view, one of the main reasons is because you want to keep these predators off the streets. You want them to be convicted. You want them to get as much prison time as can be given in our current system. Disclosures not handled correctly, as we said, will lead to much worse things down the track. In one case we came up with, the disclosure was given and the victim survivor was not believed at all. In fact, people were throwing around terms like, oh, they're a good person and they wouldn't do this. And to the point where when we went to court with this person, there was a large group of people surrounding them. And we were there and I was holding the victim survivor's hand at this point, and she grabbed my hand and nearly broke it. She was squeezing me that hard. And I turned around and I was surrounded by 5-6 people. And this was in the line to get through the metal detectors. Anyway, we went through and we found we got a room for her. We walked into the court and these people were sitting surrounding us and staring at the victim survivor. And obviously we did what we could. The bailiffs were incredible. But that's just a statement on what can go wrong if the victim survivor isn't believed and if the disclosure is handled incorrectly. The funny point to that case was when, as the courts read out the charges one by one, each of the supporters left. One by one, they lost support and just, completely distanced themselves from the perpetrator. But that was because they were lied to. That was because the perpetrator, and like a lot of child abuse perpetrators, was a master manipulator, probably still is, but I wouldn't be able to tell you that. Now, not believing victim survivors can also lead to compound trauma. We know a case where the victim survivor spoke out. She spoke out about her domestic abuse and she spoke out about her children's abuse, and she wasn't believed at all, to the point where it went to family court and the perpetrator was given sole custody of the children, And as sure you can imagine, what happened. And fast forward 5 years, and the victim survivor got her kids back, and we were supporting them through this whole process. And the kids were returned with PTSD symptoms. Their mental health had suffered so significantly that one of the children had to be permanently removed from the home and placed in a group home. Another one of the children is anorexic with suicidal ideations. Look, to us, it's a real no-brainer. Survivors who feel that they've been believed and supported through the process of disclosure will come forward, which will keep the predators off the streets. When survivors see other survivors having positive outcomes, they will then feel empowered to speak. It won't be the end of the trauma by any stretch of the imagination, but the more survivors that we can get speaking out, the more predators we can get off the streets, the less children that will be being victimised. We've spent the last 14 years speaking with survivors. Many times we've heard the stories that they've never sent it out before. The Royal Commission found that the average length of a disclosure is 29.3 years. And all too often we hear, why are they disclosing now? Why now? When other survivors hear that, they think, well, why would I bother coming forward? And that's another reason that we feel like disclosures have to be handled correctly, and we have to let people know that the disclosure is not the end of the road. It's the beginning of a whole new one. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate and you know, it really hits home the horror for many children and adults in disclosure, and why, given that's one of the impacts for people in coming forward, is that they hold on to this information, and often, you know, in doing so, maybe prioritizing their current well-being, and looking for an environment that might be supportive for them, and if not, will hold back. And I suppose I also want to acknowledge the work of your organisation and all the other organisations in offering support, recognising abuse as a very isolating experience, the need to offer support, not just to believe, but to make sure that's ongoing support for all survivors is really important. I'm now going to ask Dr. Anna Borgia to speak. She's a research fellow and psychologist at Griffith University Disrupting Violence Beacon, and Anna's going to speak about gender and culture specific experiences around disclosure across the life course. Over to you, Anna. You're on mute, Anna.
Mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Another victim of technology here, but I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we all gather and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I was in this project. I was one of the researchers really focused on the academic literature in disclosure. So I will talk a bit about that and a bit of my experience in the clinic. I work with women survivors of violence of all kinds, and that include women that come to the clinic to talk about their experience when they were children. And going through the academic literature, some that came through is how, and I think other speakers already talk about that, but how shame and blame and being made to feel guilt are dominant barriers for disclosure across the board. So we will have a specific way that people, considering their gender, considering their culture, may be shamed or may be blamed or may be made to believe that they should carry self-blame. But these across the board appear in literature. And while these victims occur in, everywhere, there was some research indicating that heightened of blame, particularly among adolescents, related to diverse religious communities. So maybe some religious values being around sex and sexuality may being used to blame people that survived abuse. Another thing that we read a lot was people saying that those feelings of blame, of shame, would be mirrored by their disclosure recipient. So there were experiences, and that again across the board, across gender, across culture. So people saying that the experience of disclosure would reinforce that in one way or another, or because people would appear to be ashamed for them, or why people would put shame back on them. One thing that was more specific in literature of some minority communities, specific when researching in most of the papers we read were in research conducted in Western countries. So usually when they talk about diverse cultures, we talk about diverse cultures inside a Western country. So this is something important to keep in mind. But the idea of not only experiencing shame, but shame being brought on the family was an idea that was more prevalent in research among minority communities, but not exclusive, but more prevalent. And this research has been conducted with strong partnership with our advisory board members. And some of our advisory board members echo that they would see what appears in that appearing literature, appearing in reality in minority communities in Australia as well. I see clients that may come for a number of different reasons, but two reasons that I see women coming to the clinic to talk about being abused when they were children. Two of the main reasons that I see are women that are actually not, they migrated, so they are not in contact with family or their community of origin anymore, and they feel that now they are in a safe place to talk about it. So as a result of the experience of migration, experience safety, they look for therapy to talk about an experience that maybe they did not disclose much or they did not disclose to a professional. And I also see clients that may bring it up when they're trying to explain to the Department of Immigration through a process of protection visa, asylum seeking, why it's not safe for them to be returned home. I was just yesterday in evening with a client that was the case. Her first experience of verbal disclosure is an experience of disclosure to the Department of Immigration when trying to explain why she cannot be returned home. So these are some of the things that came through literature. And again, some differences in how blame and shame is put on people, depending on gender, appear in the literature as well. One of the things that appeared strongly was the idea of being a survivor and being men, and the idea of masculinity associated with being strong and powerful, and therefore boys being very confused and being made to feel that they are less than being survivors. Also, as Patrick said, the idea that people, boys that particularly experience violence, may become violent themselves. So that myth holds boys back from in their mental health, but also in their willingness to disclose that they are survivors of abuse. Another thing that appeared a lot was boys being confused about their sexuality, regardless of the sexuality that they come to develop later on, and feeling that being abused by a man means something about their sexuality. On the other hand, boys that were abused by females, that were abused by presenting women, also talked about not being believed, or the abuse being played down, or even being blamed in both cases for bringing the abuse upon them. We saw that also a conversation about the difficulty sometimes as females have carrying roles over children, boys that would see that, made the line between care and grooming behaviors very hard to read, even later in life, and therefore made hard to disclosure what they actually went through. So while boys have a lot of stereotypes around masculinity, what is to be a real man, that gets in the way of them disclosing safely and them developing health, their health and well-being. Many boys, and I think a few of you already mentioned that men refer to experiences like the Royal Commission and seeing others disclosing as very empowering and as a space where they felt that they could therefore disclose as well. With girls and women, what the literature will talk about will not surprise many people. Talk about the same, inviting the abuse, women and girls being discussed as being seductress, as being of loose morals, parents in smaller communities, but across more often, but across the board, being concerned with the idea of purity or virginity, or more concerned with those ideas than the well-being of children at a first moment. So those ideas of what a girl or a woman should look like or be like is still very present on the way women are blamed and shamed, and girls are blamed and shamed for the abuse they experienced as children. And these, for boys and girls, the blaming and the shame and the saying they invited the abuse would appear even when they were abused very young. So way before puberty, there was no it was as absurd as it sounds to blame the children like that. Another part that appeared among females was that idea that they become less desirable moving forward, and that idea that they may be who they are, that suffering the abuse determines who they are, may not only harm their mental health, but their self-image and their sense of identity. So that's a real concern. And because it is a real concern, because people absorb those responses, these impacts their willingness to disclosure. This is also why many boys deny abuse if the abuse is discovered and not disclosed. One point I want to bring up is that, having said all of it, research among boys was way more prevalent than research among girls. So we see the literature has moved away from studying girls and women for some reason in the last few years, or differences in gender from that perspective. And as Patrick highlighted, all papers talk about disclosure on those lines, boys and girls, men and women. So all the literature was quite binary in that sense. So this was a bit of the difference that we observed in literature. And we can keep discussing questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'd just like to remind people that you can send questions via the chat and the Q&A function, and we'll be looking to go to them and respond. Hopefully, have time to respond to those. I'd just like to now introduce Craig Hughes-Cashmore, CEO of Survivors and Mates Support Network, who's going to speak particularly around male survivors and disclosure and queer experience. So over to you, Craig, and you're on mute.
I'm so glad you told me that. Thank you so much, Gary, and I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation today. As Gary just said, I'm the CEO of the only service dedicated to working with adult male survivors of child sexual abuse and our supporters in Australia. I'm one of the co-founders, and I have a pretty unique job. As a survivor of child sexual abuse and an advocate over the past 14 years, I have disclosed and told and retold my story ad nauseum. To the police when I first gave my statement, at conferences, training events, to media, and even the odd webinar. I was adopted, and along the way, I have made contact with my birth parents. Some of them have remarried, and I ended up with 9 parents. So I have disclosed a lot. A little bit about my journey. After 12 months of abuse at the hands of a family friend and a work colleague of my father, I disclosed at school to a trusted teacher. What I learned is that not all teachers can be trusted, because that teacher became my second perpetrator. I didn't disclose again for about 25 years, at which time I reported to the police. Patrick mentioned homophobia. It's something I know very well. I was a sensitive effeminate boy, and as a result, growing up in the 70s and into the 80s, I was called poofter, pansy, sissy, you name it, pretty much every day at school, at primary school, in my street, by adults. You know, it wasn't a good time to be gay. And I know obviously some people still struggle with that, unfortunately. But by the time I was first raped by my first perpetrator, I thought that if I disclosed, people would know I was gay. So there was no way I was going to disclose. But because I am gay, I've always struggled with intimate relationships, and drugs and alcohol have always played a significant role. I've also come to understand that at least 2 of my 4 partners were also survivors, and tragically, one of them took his own life. Bit of a diversion and an update. I was recently diagnosed with prostate cancer. And I'm telling you this because A, I want sympathy. That's a joke. B, I've become a chronic oversharer, and C, it's a good case in point because it's meant that I have found myself having to decide whether to tell the medical professionals who are helping me. But of course, you know, always the advocate, I knew I had to walk the talk, and this, you know, I use this as an opportunity to test the responses and help educate and gauge the responses, advocate for myself, of course, in this. But to my surprise, despite all the times I've disclosed and all the times I've told my story, and obviously I didn't have to go into any detail, but it was harder than I thought it would be. And it's been challenging, but they've been great, actually. And yeah, although I'm obviously dreading the operation, you know, well, it's an example, isn't it, of how many times we have to do it, and that it doesn't necessarily get easier. I'll just finish with a couple of things quickly. Last night, I attended an event called Stories That Stir in Waverley here in Sydney. It's near Bondi Junction. And it's an event at which 6 people get up and tell their stories. And they have about 10 or 15 minutes to do that. I was invited by one of the boys, I call them boys, who have done one of our 8-week groups. His name's Rob. And he told his story and talked about the 40 years of silence before he could tell his story of abuse at the hands of a woman when he was 12. And until last night, he could count on both hands how many people he told. And in that room last night, it was full. There were about 50 people, 60 people. And Rob did such an incredible job at moving us through his story, and he recounted having participated in one of Samson's 8-week groups and talked about the power of peer support and sitting in a group of guys, all survivors, a safe, professionally facilitated space, and all the boys just helping each other really to find the words and normalizing their experiences and supporting, of course, each other. I should just quickly mention, you know, that power of peer support is really what underpins our organisation. It's where we started. It was literally just me and one other guy. He was the first survivor that I had knowingly met. His name's Shane, an awesome guy. Men so often just want to start by talking to another guy. There's so, you know, we've heard here today about the shame, the stigma, all of that stuff. I really understand how difficult it can be to disclose. I feel like I'm in a bit of a privileged position because I have nothing to hide. And that is odd. Sometimes I have wished that I, you know, early on, I did wonder, you know, whether I'd done the right thing, that everyone knew my business. but there's a real freedom for me in this. There was certainly a time early on when I got really sick of and tired of telling my story, and at times when I've almost put myself to sleep in the process. These days, it's a lot more comfortable for me to just constantly disclose, and I do it because I know that by sharing and talking about child sexual abuse, it brings visibility and it can encourage others to disclose and to seek help. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Craig. I really appreciate that, and reminded us how there's multiple kind of moments where you have to decide whether to speak or not. Some of which are almost forced upon us in the way of particular circumstances and medical. And I wish you all the best, Craig, with that.
Thanks, mate.
That's all right. And so I suppose, returning to that question, I suppose it's come up repeatedly. And one of the questions is about, how do we manage mandatory reporting requirements alongside understanding disclosure is not a one-off event. So even when we're looking to respond to somebody in the first place, how do we do that in a way that acknowledges that we know that they're likely to have more than one be asked this question more and more, and how do we best support them with that knowledge that we have that there's going to be other times and there's other, particularly with mandatory reporting, there's going to be other times where other people are going to be looking to respond or looking to ask them, speak with them about what's happened to them. Is there anybody in particular who wants to put their hands up to respond to that question from our panel? Leah, that I saw you put your hand up, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary. I think this is actually it's a challenge for us. Mandatory reporting for child sexual abuse, it's really important. It's come because of our history of failures to report, that we actually had to put in law the requirement for reporting to happen so that perpetrators, institutions could not protect each other. But when you look at the literature around contemporary experiences of disclosure of young people, I think that we can lose our humanity in this process. So there are accounts of young people talking about, and I can look at some of the research that was done actually for the Royal Commission, talking to young people about their experience of safety. And one young person, I thought, as so often is the case with kids, just the wisdom of their response. They talked about disclosing, and they talked about how they could see the adult freaked out. The adult was straight away moving into, I've got to report, I've got to do this. And the young person talked about sitting on the couch by themselves as the system kind of happened around them. So yes, there are mandatory reporting requirements. And we have to comply with our legal obligations to report. But at first and foremost, there's the moment. And then as Amanda talked about, there's the aftermath. So I think it's about not losing the need to run alongside, to stay there, to stick along in that support. The other thing is to be honest with the young person, to talk to the child or young person about this is what's going to happen next here. Because the reality is, for children in particular, they lose so much agency following that disclosure. An adult survivor can choose to make a police report and not proceed. When a child discloses, so much of the decisions from that point onwards become the decisions of the adults around them. So I think we need to balance safety with the need for children's voice, children to have a say about what happens next. I don't know if, Amanda, you wanted to add anything on that.
I was just going to add also, particularly I think for young people and adults obviously, but young people, having that conversation afterwards in terms of this is my responsibility, but your choice and control in this is you don't have to talk when someone else comes to ask you about it. So yes, the system around them needs to do certain things to ensure safety and protect them. And as you said, we've got very valid and required reasons for that. But really supporting them to understand, and even children where it's developmentally, you can support them to do that, giving them back some of that choice and control, trying to push the system as an advocate to go, well, let's do this in a different way. You don't have to talk about it today, or you don't have to talk about it tomorrow, or we can really advocate and negotiate for how they might want to do that, or they can stay silent until they're ready again. It is so I think really advocating for that choice and control, giving that back, because as you said, Leah, they lose so much agency and the system kind of happens around them. But giving that back to them is really important.
Thanks very much, Amanda.
Yeah. And Gary, I just wanted to add one point too, because it really builds on Amanda's point. And this comes from, talking to adult survivors, reflecting about the time that they disclosed, and often things being taken away from them at that time, them being withdrawn from different activities, and that they really experience that as a punishment that reinforces shame and blame. And so, whilst the disclosure isn't something we should be exceptionalizing from all their other aspects of their identity.
Thanks very much, Patrick. And I don't think we've mentioned it here, but I think we're very aware now with the child maltreatment study that we're talking about 37.3% of females and 18.8% of males are going to experience childhood sexual abuse before the age of 18. And that's 1 in 3, 1 in 6 people in our community. And I think one of the things, just thinking and listening and really reflecting on what the literature review is showing, is about we're skewed to our responses to children. It's about our service responses and mandatory responses as much as anything. But if you think about what I just said about under 18, the majority of people, 70+% of people, are actually over 18, and so there's so many more adult survivors. So really, I just want to invite panel members to reflect on. So if we know that there's adult survivors walking around in our community, 1 in 3, 1 in 6 males, so what is the best response to an adult survivor? Where the mandatory reporting isn't of the same nature, maybe, but it's about what's the best human response to them. And I'm thinking about the services, we've heard from Adam, we've heard from Craig and things like that. From your perspective, what is the best response somebody can give?
Oh, sorry. Best response. Oh,
yes.
Sorry.
Yep. Hang on, just hold on one sec, Adam. I think Craig was going to jump in, and then we'll.
No, go to Adam. He'll be better.
Okay, Adam, you go.
Thanks, Adam.
The best response is one that we try to give at FACAR. For my money anyway, I could be completely off base, but we try and give a holistic approach. For example, our court support program starts quite often with disclosure. We will go with the victim survivor once they have disclosed and go to the actual police station with them, ensure that they're speaking to child abuse detectives, things like that. And then we're with them at every court date where, if we can, we'll get our court support dog in there. And also post and in between court dates, we're with them in terms of we sponsor them to do empowering activities like martial arts, gymnastics, dance, but just anything that's going to get them moving and get them, pumping the endorphins out, and just to help as a distraction, even especially as they get closer to upcoming court dates. And then once court's done, we try and stay with them in the Phoenix program, which is the program that sees them sponsored to do empowering activities. I don't think you can give a victim survivor a single one-shot approach. I don't think you can be with them just in the courtroom. I feel like the times in between court dates will increase, success of the court process itself. But yeah, that's, as I said, that's just our approach.
Adam, I really appreciate that, because it's because if we think about it, we've had this kind of research looking at the systems response, etc., and other people, or the initial disclosure. But what we're talking about is a person here, and about their well-being, their overall well-being, and that disclosure might be about safety, it might be about holding people to account, it might be about many things, just letting people know so they can get on with their lives. So just to hear of things like having a support dog, because I've heard from so many people about having just somebody or something alongside you, is really important at these times. Craig, was there anything you want to add in that how do you best respond? What are we looking for?
Well, how do you best respond? I think you've just said it really. I mean, it really depends on the circumstances, Are you talking to a guy who's locked up in prison? Are you talking to someone who's in a rehab or an AA meeting? I think basically, I'm sorry to hear that. And how are you traveling? That's kind of it. I mean, it sort of depends on the kind of human being you are, right? But for me, it's that simple, because if they want to answer, they will. But you're not prying, you're not kind of hitting anybody, but you've heard them and you're asking how they are. And, you don't need to be any kind of expert just to do that and be there for someone, in my opinion. That's why these discussions are so important. Education, community awareness is so important. We've got to remove all this shame and stigma, because most people, this again, my position means that I meet people all the time. They know what my job is. They know who I am. And, as we all know, everyone has a story. Like, you know what I mean? It's rare that people don't know anyone or don't have their own lived experience. It's rare. So I just wish we could all have the courage to have these sorts of conversations and be there for people, because my God, things would change hugely if we could just break through that. And I also think, and I've said this before, but I think as adults, we still struggle to have these conversations. And if we can't, how can we expect children to?
Can I add?
Age appropriate conversations, of course. Sorry.
Yeah.
There.
I was just going to add, Craig, your point about how we're all going to know people, and Gary, your point about the statistics. I think we've got to think about disclosure as not just the what we do if someone makes a disclosure to us. It's actually how we carry ourselves in society, because victim survivors of child sexual abuse are important members of our community and far too big a population. And that means that when you're commenting on a newspaper article, when you're talking about some kind of event in the lunchroom at work, that actually they are all responses to disclosure, and the person beside you may be a silent victim of child sexual abuse who looks at your response and says, well, that's why I'm not saying a thing. So to me, responding to disclosure is actually about thinking about those contexts, and that every single one of us has got a role to play in creating contexts that make it safe.
Thank you, Leah. I think that's that question of how we act, how we behave, how we speak in our daily lives, because these are people we live and work with every day, people, survivors. It can either open up or close down conversations around this subject. And it seems, and also I just want to kind of go back to you, Leah, in a sense of some of that you kind of spoke a little bit about, I think, earlier on. We've got this kind of thought that we should be encouraging disclosure. It feels like that's where we're looking to go. Whereas, are we sure that this is what survivors are looking for from us, that we should be asking them and creating this place where they should disclose?
I think that, to me, it's about we should be creating an environment where survivors can make the choice and assume a positive response. But think about all those many purposes of disclosure, about forming relationships, about seeking help, about whether you do or don't disclose in a medical context. We actually know we don't have contexts that are universally positive. In fact, the literature showed we've still got so many negative responses. We need to trust victim survivors and their agency and control. You know, the victim survivors, and there was a lot of, actually a theme in the literature, who said, I'm not disclosing to my family because I'm worried about my elderly mum and the impacts it will have on her at this point in her life. That's a conscious choice, and it's a choice that we should respect. So to me, it's about all having a responsibility to create contexts in which it's okay to disclose, but privileging survivor agency at the centre.
Thanks, Rochelle. So this kind of broadens this out in the broader conversation of how we talk about abuse, about child sexual abuse. And so it's not just about how we talk with that particular person, it's the context in which we talk about this topic, which for many people, it's the words they may never thought they were going to say. And trying to create a space where they're being supported and heard is key. And I recognise people have kind of touched on that quite a bit. I know we've spoken a little about the legal, and there's a question here about that. How do we improve the legal and the adversarial system? You know, is this have we stepped down that road enough, or is there other stuff we need to do to support that process so that people do feel supported within that legal system?
I wonder, Adam, if you might want to speak there about, I know you had been quite involved in developing up an approach, but then seeing it kind of diminishing over time.
Adam just wants you to repeat the question, please.
Do you want me to go to it, Claire? You know, one of the questions was, what people are talking about, how do we, you know, our legal system is very adversarial, and it's, you know, the questions come around disclosure, and it becomes a very kind of acute focus. How have you found the best way to support people, or in that system? Is it advocating for the system change, or is it advocating for better support for people, or is it both, Adam?
It has to be both. It has to be both. Craig and I were both involved in a systemic change called the Children's Champion Program years ago. And, you know, that had several great changes. It's been clawed back now, unfortunately. But no, when we were involved in that, we had amazing hope for a whole systemic change, which is, you know, as I said, unfortunately not eventuated. But you have to remove the adversarial nature of the system. You have to remove the perpetrator-focused system as a whole, and it has to become a victim-survivor-centric system with the needs of the victim-survivor at the absolute forefront. But also, and by the same token, you still need to support the victim-survivor throughout, and in an individual manner as well. That's once again entirely victim survivor centric and tailored to their individual needs.
Thanks very much, Adam. I'm very much aware of the time, and I suppose one of the things I'm aware of, that this is a research. This is the initial findings of the literature review, and this is a process where the next step is very much hearing from victim survivors. And you know, if you think about what we've heard today about the importance of listening to victim survivors and hearing from them across the life course, they're recognizing this doesn't just go away, that there's opportunities for people to be supported every time, and they're making critical decisions for themselves when they're engaging in new relationships, when people are engaging with work, with medical difficulties, with home environment and questions. So we're very much looking forward to this next phase of speaking and hearing directly from them. And I suppose one of the things that's really come through both in the literature review but in our conversations today is about a person-centered response, about understanding the victim survivors' experience and seeing how we can best support them. And you know, those questions, you know, even that simple question Craig asked, so how are you traveling? It's so important in thinking about how response, in having that, as Liz mentioned, that human response to this very difficult issue. Just in wrapping up, I'd like to thank all of our presenters here today. I appreciate everybody who's contributed to this this literature review and the research process. I'd like to thank you, Patrick. I thank you, Leah. I'd like to thank you, Adam. I'd like to thank you, Amanda. I'd like to thank you, Craig. I'd like to thank you, Anna. I think everybody who's supported the process, but also those people who've participated. The recording will be made available, hopefully within the next week. We will send a link to anybody who's registered to their email for you to hear from us. Please continue to watch this space. And we're looking forward from hearing from people and supporting the process. We have not identified yet who will be interviewing, etc. So that is a process that's still happening. But we're looking to hear from people about their experience and what's important to them in this process. So thank you very much for everybody who attended today and all the contributions and the questions.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Do take care. Continue to prioritize your well-being and live live rich lives that all survivors deserve.
Thank you.